Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, May 7th, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will reach a comfortable 72.5 degrees, with the low dipping to 57.4, so it looks like we're in for a very pleasant day. On the program today, we'll explore the potential reasons and implications behind former President Trump's reported plans to officially rename the Persian Gulf, a move that could have significant geopolitical ripples. We'll also be taking a close look at the Federal Reserve's decision-making process, specifically why it's choosing to hold interest rates steady, even as ongoing tariff discussions create uncertainty in the economic landscape. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this morning with a story that's certainly making some waves in international diplomacy. President Trump is reportedly planning a significant shift in U.S. policy concerning a very well-known body of water. For more on this, we turn to our news reporter, Ethan. Ethan, what can you tell us?
Grace, this is quite a development. Multiple outlets, including ABC News and KTAR.com, both citing the Associated Press, are reporting that President Trump intends to announce the U.S. will officially refer to the Persian Gulf as the Arabian Gulf, or perhaps the Gulf of Arabia.
The Arabian Gulf? Data SA names some countries in the region prefer, but ETA S a big change for U.S. policy. When and where is this announcement expected?
According to that same Associated Press report, also shared on Reddit's r/politics forum, the president is expected to make this announcement during an upcoming trip to Saudi Arabia. This visit will also reportedly include stops in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates.
And what is the thinking behind this, Ethan? Is this about redrawing maps, or is there a deeper diplomatic current here?
It seems to be very much a diplomatic gesture. ABC News and the Associated Press note this move is widely interpreted as an effort to strengthen ties with Arab nations, which have long advocated for this name change. Perplexity API sources confirm that as of today, May 7, 2025, this plan is in the works, though it's not yet official and certainly not universally accepted.
Has President Trump waded into these waters before? It feels like we have heard whispers of this in the past.
You're right, Grace. Perplexity API reports highlight that during his first term, he used the term Arabian Gulf in some official contexts. In fact, the Associated Press, via that Reddit share, noted that back in 2017, his reference to the area as the Gulf of Arabia sparked a diplomatic spat with Iran.
So despite those earlier mentions, the official U.S. stance remained unchanged until now?
Precisely. Perplexity API clarifies the U.S. Department of State and, crucially, the U.S. Board on Geographic Names, or BGN, continue to use Persian Gulf in official documents. The BGN is the body responsible for official U.S. geographic names, and they stuck with Persian Gulf, aligning with international standards. So it wasn't a government-wide policy change back then.
I can imagine this isn't going down well with everyone, particularly Iran. What's their reaction?
It's highly controversial, especially with Tehran. ABC News reports, Iran has historically maintained the name Persian Gulf since the 16th century, and views any attempt to change it as a politically motivated act of hostility. Iranian officials reportedly condemned the potential change, asserting that while it won't have any legal or geographical effect, it will, quote, provoke anger from Iranians worldwide, end quote. The Associated Press similarly notes this is seen as a snub to Iran.
So, President Trump can declare this for U.S. official use, but can he actually change what the world calls it? Does he have that authority?
That's a key point. ABC News points out that while he can change the name for U.S. government purposes, he cannot dictate what the rest of the world calls it. The International Hydrographic Organization standardizes names for bodies of water, but countries sometimes differ. Even on maps, Perplexity API mentions Google Maps in the U.S., lists it as Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, showing dual usage, while Apple Maps just says Persian Gulf.
This isn't the first time the Trump administration has considered renaming geographical features, is it? It sounds like they're really trying to chart a new course with names.
Indeed. ABC News notes President Trump previously suggested renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And the Associated Press actually sued the Trump administration earlier this year after being barred from White House events for not adhering to an executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a history here with geographical nomenclature, a real penchant for name-dropping, you could say.
Has there been any official comment from the White House on this latest plan for the Persian Gulf?
As of the latest reports from KTAR.com, neither the White House nor the National Security Council had commented, so we're waiting for that official word. It's important to remember this is a planned announcement, and for it to become the definitive U.S. designation, it would need official documentation and implementation by the BGN.
Lot to watch there. It seems the story will continue to ripple out. Thanks so much for navigating us through those details, Ethan.
My pleasure, Grace. And just to recap for our viewers, the information we discussed today comes from a variety of sources, including ABC News, KTAR.com, the Associated Press, with some information shared via Reddit, and Perplexity API.
Turning now to the economy, all eyes are on the Federal Reserve today as they're widely expected to make a key decision on interest rates. For more on this, we're joined by our economics reporter, Chloe. Chloe, what are we anticipating from the Fed?
Grace, the consensus is that the Federal Reserve will likely keep its key borrowing rate steady, holding it within the current 4.25% to 4.5% range. According to a summary provided by Weeds, which sources a Perplexity API output, this would actually mark the third consecutive meeting where the federal funds rate remains unchanged.
Holding steady again, what's the main reason for this cautious approach from the Fed?
The primary driver, Grace, is the significant economic uncertainty stemming from President Trump's tariff policies. These aren't small measures. The Public's Radio, or TPR, highlights a broad 10% levy on nearly all U.S. imports and a substantial 145% import tax on goods coming from China. NPR adds that because of these tariffs, Americans are currently paying higher taxes on imported goods than at any point since the 1930s.
That has a significant impact. Has Fed Chair Jerome Powell commented on these trade policies?
He has. Both NPR and TPR report that Chair Powell has publicly acknowledged the potential repercussions. He stated that the tariffs are likely to cause both higher inflation and slower economic growth. That's a tough combination.
It certainly sounds like it. So with these tariffs in play, what does the current economic landscape actually look like?
Is a complex picture. For instance, TPR and the Perplexity API summary via WITS note that the U.S. economy contracted in the first quarter of 2025, with gross domestic product, or GDP, shrinking at an annualized rate of 0.3%. This is partly because businesses and consumers were stockpiling goods, anticipating even more tariff increases.
A shrinking economy is concerning. What about inflation? That's usually a key factor for the Fed.
It is, and inflation is sending mixed signals. NPR noted that inflation was, quote, relatively tame recently, end quote, and the Perplexity API, again via bits, indicated easing price pressures in the Consumer Price Index and personal consumption expenditures. However, digging deeper, a direct output from the Perplexity API specified that core CPI inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, was 3.0% on an annualized basis in the first quarter of 2025. More recent data, also from the Perplexity API, shows the annual inflation rate for the 12 months ending March 2025 was 2.4%. But core inflation for March stood at 3.1%, its lowest since April 2021. The concern, though, is that the same source forecasts core CPI inflation could rise into the 3.5 to 4% range by the end of this year due to these tariffs.
So some relief, but potential trouble ahead. How is the job market holding up amidst all this?
The job market has shown resilience so far. NPR reported it hasn't been significantly affected yet, and TPR described it as, quote, relatively stable, end quote. The Perplexity API, through WETS, even characterized the labor market as, quote, robust, end quote. This strength actually gives the Fed less immediate cause to stimulate the economy through rate cuts. However, consumer confidence has dropped, according to NPR, and business surveys cited by both NPR and TPR indicate widespread concerns about tariffs disrupting supply chains.
And of course, President Trump has not been shy about sharing his views on the Fed's actions.
That's right. As reported by NPR and TPR, President Trump has been very vocal, repeatedly demanding interest rate cuts. NPR noted he specifically pointed to the drop in gasoline prices as a reason for easing rates, and has even hinted at the possibility of replacing Fed Chair Powell when his term expires in May 2026, which is just about a year from now. TPR added that Trump had even suggested firing Powell, though he later seemed to walk that back.
That puts the Federal Reserve in quite a bind. It sounds like they're navigating some very choppy economic waters.
Absolutely. NPR and TPR outline this dilemma clearly. If the Fed raises interest rates to combat the inflationary pressures, potentially made worse by tariffs, it could dampen the job market. But if they lower rates to stimulate economic activity, as the president urges, it could fuel further inflation. The worst-case scenario, highlighted by both outlets, would be if the tariffs trigger both rising inflation and increasing unemployment simultaneously.
So the Fed is holding steady for now. But what are financial markets thinking? Are they expecting any movement later this year?
Despite the Fed's current cautious stance, financial markets are anticipating potential shifts. The Perplexity API, through both WETS and direct outputs, indicates that markets are currently pricing in potential 25 basis point rate cuts for later in 2025, with some even expecting up to 3 such cuts in the second half of the year. This reflects an expectation that economic conditions might soften, or the Fed might need to address risks to growth.
What would it take for those rate cuts to actually happen?
The Perplexity API suggests specific conditions would need to materialize. Economically, that means a significant reduction in actual inflation, bringing it closer to the Fed's 2% target, a further slowdown in GDP, or a noticeable weakening in the labor market. On the policy side, the Fed might adopt more flexible inflation targeting or reassess if tariffs are less inflationary than feared. However, it's crucial to note, as emphasized by the Perplexity API, that the actual economic data for the rest of 2025 isn't available yet. While inflation has moderated some, it remains above the Fed's target, and that first quarter GDP contraction is a concern. So the conditions analysts believe would justify rate cuts haven't fully materialized to a degree that would compel immediate Fed action.
It sounds like the Fed has a very delicate balancing act ahead, navigating these, shall we say, tariff IC times. Chloe, thank you for shedding light on this complex situation for us.
You're welcome, Grace. It will certainly be an interesting period to watch.
Here are some other headlines. In the Red Sea, an F/A-18 Super Hornet slid off the USS Harry S. Truman Tuesday night after its tailhook reportedly failed during landing. Both pilots ejected safely with minor injuries. This is the second F/A-18 lost by the carrier, which is operating to secure shipping lanes from Houthi threats in under a week. Another jet fell off during a towing operation in the hangar bay on April 28th. The USS Truman has been deployed for 8 months, involved in U.S. airstrikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen. Investigations are ongoing into both incidents, which occurred on a day there were reports of the Houthis taking a shot at the carrier, despite President Trump's announcement of a ceasefire. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with U.S. President Donald Trump in the Oval Office on Tuesday, May 6, 2025. Against a backdrop of strained U.S.-Canada relations due to tariffs and Mr. Trump's past remarks about Canada becoming a 51st state, the president congratulated Mr. Carney, who was elected partly on an anti-Trump platform. During the meeting, President Trump referred to the U.S.-Canada border as artificial and again joked about Canada joining the U.S. Prime Minister Carney firmly rejected this, stating, "Canada is not for sale. It won't be for sale, ever." and asked the president to stop the 51st state references. On trade, President Trump indicated U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods would not be lifted, while Mr. Carney called it a bigger discussion and emphasized Canada's role as the U.S.'s largest trading partner. Mr. Carney also acknowledged President Trump's NATO efforts and committed Canada to increased military participation and security investments. Columbia University is laying off nearly 180 researchers. This follows a significant reduction in federal funding, with the Trump administration canceling approximately $400 million in research grants for the university. The administration cited alleged failures by Columbia to address anti-Semitism on campus as the reason. These layoffs represent about 20% of the researchers whose grants were terminated. Columbia University is reportedly engaged in discussions to restore the funding and is also adjusting expenditures. A travel update. As of May 7, 2025, most U.S. air travelers 18 and older need a real ID-compliant driver's license or ID card, typically marked with a gold star, or another acceptable form of identification, like a passport, global entry card, or tribal and military IDs, to fly domestically. Those without a real ID and no other accepted ID will face extra screening and potential delays, though they will not be denied boarding if they undergo these additional checks. This requirement, part of the Real ID Act passed in 2005, aims to bolster security. Officials note about 81% of travelers at TSA checkpoints already present an acceptable ID. And in a world first, conservationists in New Zealand have filmed a rare Powellophanта augusta snail laying an egg from its neck. This large, threatened carnivorous land snail, endemic to New Zealand, was documented at a South Island conservation facility where nearly 1,900 are cared for in an environment mimicking their alpine habitat. The egg, resembling a tiny hen's egg, emerges from an opening below the snail's head. These snails are hermaphrodites, and some in captivity are 25 to 30 years old. This unique footage has surprised researchers and highlights the importance of ongoing conservation. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with Claude Sonnet 3.7, Gemini Pro 2.5 Experimental, Gemini Flash 2.0, Perplexity Sonar Pro, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.